Biden is basically continuing the same policy in his foreign policy. So domestically, he will criticize Nazis, but when the US empire sees it's politically advantageous to support Nazis abroad, not just in Ukraine. I mean, I mentioned Syria, I mentioned Libya. We know that the United States has a history of arming and training these extremist far-right death squads that were linked to al-Qaeda in Syria. And what is the equivalent of that in Ukraine? The Jabhat al-Nusra of Syria in Ukraine would be the Azov regiment. And we have many pieces of evidence showing that the US military has supported Azov. I want to remind viewers that the Azov regiment, this neo-Nazi gang, is part of the Ukrainian National Guard. It was incorporated into the Ukrainian state after the 2014 coup backed by the US that overthrew the elected government of Ukraine. And Azov has posted photos on its official website showing Azov fighters meeting with US military officers and also Canadian military officers. And more recently, we saw that the group Nexta, which is a propaganda arm of the Western-backed Belarusian opposition based in exile, even this group that is extremely anti-Russian, they posted photos on Nexta of these Azov Nazis getting training from NATO personnel and receiving NATO weapons to fight Russians. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and even ISIS all have their origins in US wars and CIA operations. It was, in fact, the US war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the proxy war, in which the CIA, Pakistani intelligence, and Saudi Arabia funded and trained and armed the Mujahideen in order to bleed the Soviet Union. That gave birth to al-Qaeda and the Taliban, who, of course, then went to the West and carried out all these terrorist attacks. Of course, there's a very similar story for ISIS in Syria. And I think there are a lot of people now who are rightfully concerned that many of these neo-Nazis that are being supported by NATO now in Ukraine, that when the war ends, and the war is eventually going to end, where are all of these heavily armed and trained Nazis going to go? I mean, there's very real concerns that they could go to the West and carry out terrorist attacks, just as the extremist far-right Islamist groups backed by the CIA and NATO in Afghanistan in the 1980s and Syria in the past decade